Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name is, of course, Csaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 in 2023. Today we're having kind of a, brainstorming video, just thinking about some of the things that Guild Wars 2 could introduce in their upcoming expansions. For those of you who are unaware, Guild Wars 2 is pursuing kind of a different approach to expansions, where they're dialing back the scope of each of the expansions, but trying to do them more frequently, almost on a yearly cadence is kind of the plan. We'll see how much that works out. But it does lead for some interesting guesswork as to what might actually be involved in each of these expansions. One of the things that they've been pretty clear about is that they're clearly not going to be the same scope as the expansions that came out every 2 to 3 years, because that's just not feasible. And with that, they're likely not going to have elite specs in every single expansion for every single class, because that's just a tremendous amount of work. So in this video, we're just going to brainstorm and talk about some of the things that they could be bringing and some of the things I'm most excited to see come in these future expansions. But just before we do, I should mention I am a Guild Wars 2 or ArenaNet partner. Does that mean I won't say the bad about Guild Wars 2? No, I'll say the good, the bad, the medium. I'll say pretty much everything. What it does mean, though, is that there are 2 sponsor referral links in the description section below. If you use either of these, they do support the channel. One of them is to purchase any of the existing expansions for the game, and the other one is to sign up for free. Both of them, once again, do help the channel. With that said, though, let's dive into the discussion. So I think the best way to start this is to talk about what I think the most probable or obvious things that will come in the expansion are. And the 2 big ones are obviously continuation of a story of some sort and new maps. These are things that both Guild Wars 2 seems able to put out pretty consistently, and something that if they didn't have, it would really not feel like an expansion. I mean, you can't have a story that doesn't really take place in anywhere new. I mean, you could have one in a bunch of existing maps, but I feel like it would really fall flat if there wasn't even one new map included. I don't know if they'll have the same amount or number of maps as they have in past expansions, but I certainly think they'll be introducing some new maps to the expansion. And then the story. If you don't have a story, I mean, you could feasibly have just a feature expansion, but even then, I think story is so critical to what Guild Wars 2 does pretty well. Not always in terms of what the actual narrative is about, but certainly in terms of delivery. I think it's very critical to the gameplay loop for a lot of players. So those are the 2 things I think we'll for sure have. The other ones that I think are more up for debate and things that have obviously happened in past expansions are things such as elite specs or any major changes to combat. Any new features, so we're looking at things like fishing, we're looking at mounts, we're looking at gliding and masteries and stuff like that. Those are what I would, categorize as new features. And then maybe anything in terms of instanced content, right? If we're looking at new fractals, new strikes, new raids, those are kind of the 3 main categories that I'd want to touch on in this video. And I think I'd like to talk about the combat first, because it's the one they've provided the most amount of information about. And they've been pretty clear that, at least in this coming expansion, that we should not expect elite specs for each of the classes as we've seen in the past few ones. And I think that's fair. I think even if they were continuing to do their existing expansions, the ones that happened every 2 to 3 years, there was eventually going to be a point where they had to stop doing that. Because, not only is it a lot of work to develop these each and every time, it makes balancing the game, so much more difficult each and every time they're adding all of these new specs. There's now another factor to consider into balancing, right? And it just keeps growing and growing and growing. The other aspect that they kind of touched on more was the idea that at a certain point, they fleshed out, as many of these kind of directions for each of the jobs or classes in the best way they can. And it kind of becomes hard to make elite specs that don't feel like they're kind of like another one that just maybe does something better. And I can kind of see that point, but I'd say they probably could theory craft a few more before they hit that really hard limit. So with that, what do I think we could expect? I would not be surprised if we don't see much in the way of combat shifts for this most upcoming expansion. But in terms of future ones of this scope, I think, there's a bunch of different ways they could do this. Number one, they could do elite specs just for some classes. This one's kind of cool because you still get elite specs, but also kind of bad because like some people are just going to get nothing while others get a whole bunch. I think the more interesting route would be to really take a look at weapons. I think this is something that Guild Wars 2 has not touched for like since the start of the game almost, and it's something that I've always considered, one of the more interesting aspects of what Guild Wars 2 does, the fact that your weapons change the skills you use. I think one of the easiest initial steps into this would be letting other classes use weapons that other classes can use. So, like, what's an example? I'm trying to think of what class can't use something, but, if Mesmer can't use the hammer, the great hammer, the two-handed hammer, giving them access to that and seeing what those 5 skills look like, right? That's kind of a way you could branch things out and give more play, like more theory crafting with the same level of elite specs. And I would do that probably to each class. The benefit of using existing weapons is that they don't have to make new models as well. They can just kind of use the existing weapons that are in the game, and it's a pretty, I want to say like low effort, but it's still probably a tremendous lift. But relative to making brand new elite specs for every single class is probably more feasible. The step ahead of that, or like a little bit up from that, would be the idea of actually introducing net new weapons, adding like a, I don't know, what's a crossbow or something like that to the game that's not in the game currently, and then introducing it to certain classes. I think the thing you would run into there is the idea, once again, that you could introduce a weapon that only a few classes could use, because I don't know if you'd want to introduce so many weapons that every class gets a new weapon. That might be a lot. But there's definitely a lot of playroom room to play with those kind of introductions. I think it's, we can think of New World that does this a lot. That's how they kind of branch out their game, is that they introduce new weapons. And love it or hate it, they're, a very specific play style it caters to. But it is really exciting when there's a brand new way of the play that's introduced to a lot of different specs. So I think it's something that they should keep in their mind. With that, let's transition to the next thing, which is features. I think this one is probable just because the scope of it can shift very dramatically. A feature can be as small as like a set of mini games or something like that, or a new way for guilds to interact, and as large as a sweeping thing like mastery system or mounts or something like that. I certainly don't think we're going to get something as large as mounts or masteries added in this most recent or upcoming expansion. But I do think there's a lot of room for us to get like a mastery itself, like just one different thing or a different specific mount. And that's kind of what we saw with the most recent expansion that we played, where we got skiffs, right, which are essentially a version of the mount system, right? So there's probably ways they could play with that. I don't know if they need more mounts at this point, but they certainly can do some other stuff to try and make it more interesting. Maybe there's stuff that they could do with gliding to kind of revamp things. They haven't touched gliding in a really long time, and there's not necessarily something that I like think it's missing per se, but it's one of my more enjoyed masteries that they've ever added. And maybe there's like mini games that make use of gliding that they could do, and just play around with that. I think there's also a lot of room for them to build upon the world exploration feature. I think it's one of the most powerful things that Guild Wars 2 does, is really make it rewarding to explore a lot of the world. But the actual building blocks of that, like the different things you discover and stuff, have remained the same for a while. Maybe there are some different kind of ways they could elevate that. I think of, things in World of Warcraft, like, what was it, like archaeology and stuff like that, like ways you could make it more engaging to go back to some of these other maps and do some more exploration, and certainly some of the new maps that are coming. So I have less ideas of what they should do here, but I think it's more reasonable that they will do something, just because it can be like a smaller scope in nature. The last one, of course, is the different instance content. It's kind of interesting where a lot of the past expansions actually haven't launched with new, instance content, it's kind of different than a lot of, like, when we see World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy 14. Often one of the selling points is, oh, you're getting 4 new dungeons, you're getting 8 new dungeons, you're getting a raid, like that's usually what they hype up. In Guild Wars 2, you're getting the maps, you're getting the story, you're getting the living world that will eventually see the introduction of different instance content throughout the rest of the year. So I don't know if they would change that, but I kind of think it might be a smart thing for them to do, to make the expansion feel a little bit more meaty in a lot of ways, is to have the instance content come out at the same time. If you had a fractal and a strike and a weapon that's got given to other professions, and a little like new mastery that was applicable to a lot of different maps like that, maybe all those together does make a small expansion that feels pretty full. So I think there's room for them to do that. The negative of doing that would be if they're not able to do another strike or another fractal until the next year's expansion. It's probably not worth doing that. It's probably worth spreading it out throughout the year, just so that they do have exciting things for people to come back to, right? Because that's the other thing. And Final Fantasy kind of says that they like this too, where players come in for the new content, resub for a few months, and then go away. Guild Wars 2 is that to the extreme. When there is no sub, people flock in, I'm sure, for each new update and then take a break. And that's certainly how I play the game. I'm someone who's very casual with Guild Wars 2, but I am very excited to see what the expansion is and buy it and try it. So it's one of those things where they need each update to feel big enough that people want to like update the game and actually come back in and check it. Whereas if they do have everything just in this one big expansion like that works well probably for the few months around there, but then they'll have a very dead game for the rest of the year. So it is something to balance. It's something I'm very excited to see how they do. I've said this in many videos, but the one thing Guild Wars 2 has done a lot throughout its history is adapt. It's no secret that they are open to changing how they operate, how they deliver content, and I'd say at this point it's almost to their detriment. Like, they need to start finding something that they're happy with and that players can actually like understand and expect in terms of content delivery. So hopefully this new system works well for their team, works well for the players, and we can just move forward knowing, hey, this is what content looks like, and then everyone's happy. But yeah, those are my main thoughts for the expansion. I'm really excited to see any kind of announcement of what will be included and get more details as we get closer. I am of the opinion that we'll probably be receiving this expansion, pretty soon, like within the next few months, just because of how much they've wanted to talk about it, and because of the fact that it is a lower scope than a lot of their past expansions. But I could be wrong on that. We'll have to see. But yeah, share what you think should come in the expansion in the comments below. I'd like to hear from you, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.